Now going to introduce our last speaker, is Konrad Collao, and Konrad has over 20 years experience in researching issues of culture and identity, primarily for media, technology and entertainment brands. He's a co-founder of Craft and has worked across the globe on youth and beyond for an illustrious list of clients including Netflix, the BBC, the Cabinet Office, McDonald's, Channel 4, Vodafone, the FA and the Discovery networks. Konrad will be exploring the generation game, which is based on years of cultural research among young people, and he's looking at the pros and cons of generational thinking. So welcome, Konrad.
Yes. Out of interest, anyone remember the generation game? Yeah, some people do. Yeah, not all 23. And who here's 24? No one? Okay. There you go. Right, so mine's going to be a bit... I'm kind of going to end up in a very similar place to Matilda, but via a kind of different route. We're going to talk about generational theory, which Matilda touched on. And we're going to talk about the pitfalls of it. And it's important to say that this is not a talk that says it's useless or it's meaningless. What it does say, though, is that we should use it judiciously and understand how it works and when we use it. And I think that's something that is quite often missed, especially by PR-hungry brands who just want to put something out there that Gen Z is or millennials are and all that kind of stuff. So, a question. Who said this and how long ago? Very good. Very good. That's almost 2,500 years ago. And we continue to lazy other young people. So we will happily stand up here and say, oh, Gen X is this, Gen Z. Well, they're not young anymore. I'm Gen X. How many people know what the basis of millennials is? Where does that come from? It's from two guys, academics, quite well-known academics in their field, guys called Strauss and Howe. And their theory is, in my opinion, absolute rubbish. But the fact is that most people in here have probably no idea. And most people who use the term millennials have absolutely no idea which cohort they're talking about, why they're talking about them, and what might define millennials. And I suppose that's the whole point of this speech, is to say we need to be critical when we're using some of these concepts that we use around generations. The reason I asked, what is anyone 24, is because beforehand everyone had asked who here is 23 or under. In my household, my wife is 14 months younger than me, but she's a millennial and I'm Gen X. So we are totally different, have totally different value systems, and have nothing in common, apart from the fact that my wife can barely use a VOD player, sometimes likes Poirot, and I don't. So, I mean, this is a bit of flippancy and that kind of stuff. But, there are some really interesting, good articles taking down things like the concept of millennials. And I particularly like this one in The Atlantic about how every generation has been the me generation. And what it looks at is the front covers of Time magazine. So an August publication like Time magazine that you'd expect to have, quite a critical, long-term view of the world. And every generation since boomers has been labelled the me generation by the generation above them. So what we can probably gather from that is that the world is going to hell in a handcart and young people are feckless and rubbish. Or maybe they're just young. Right, so it can be very useful. But we've talked about some of these, the excellent speeches already have talked about some of these things that we have to understand, which is variety. So Steve's talked about variety, hasn't he? He said, well, not all of them are the same. Some hold radically different views from wokeness, the wokeness that Sophia talked about. So they're not all the same as one another. They're not necessarily that different from people older than them, either. We kind of have this idea that they must be different. Well, they are in some ways, but in other ways they're not going to be. Their economic background and all those kind of things can make them very, very similar to people who might be much, much older. And they're not necessarily that different to how older cohorts were when they were their age. And there are some really interesting studies looking at that. And there's a very interesting government foresight horizon scanning project that looks back over about 30 years worth of data, looking at how people's attitudes change over their lifetime. And you'll see that there's a whole lot more consistency between 16 to 24s now and 16 to 24s then than we might imagine and that we're led to believe if we just look at things through a purely generational lens. So, as Steve said, we do loads of work. We're not a youth research or insight agency. We are a culture insight agency. One of the biggest projects we've done over the past couple of years is a 2-year study looking at what is the UK thinking and feeling. Now, if you want a broad brief, that's one for you. Fascinating, lovely thing to play with. These photos come from one reasonably big project about youth culture and local identity. These are all participants in our project, people we heard from. They're all aged 16 to 24. Just look at them. We've got single mums, we've got people whose mums won't let them out on the estate without coming on a visit with us because they're worried about them getting beaten up. We've got mixed race couples, we've got people who live by the beach, we've got people who live in Fulham. We've got people in school uniform. We've got people hanging out with their mum, we've got people in Box Park in Brixton, we've got people in a park in Salisbury. And this is all in the UK, let alone across the globe, right? The difference of experience, within a nine-year cohort is huge. We should remember that at a base level of universal human needs, young people remain very similar to people of previous generations, right? The teenager was invented as a concept in the 1950s by us, the marketing and communications industry, and things haven't changed that much for teenagers in, 70 years, right? Essentially, it's a period of enormous change. The only other time of such biological change, apart from adolescence, is when you're a toddler, and I've got one at the moment, and it's hell. But, you're becoming an adult, right? You're having new experiences. Your horizons are getting wider. When you're 16, you might just be doing your GCSEs in this country. You might not go much further, especially if you live in a small town, than your sixth form college, down the road, the local playing fields, that kind of stuff. By the time you're 24, you could be backpacking around Bali, doing all that kind of stuff, right? So massive differences. But the world, what does bind these people together is that their world is constantly getting larger, and they're assuming more and more responsibility. But they're young people, they're full of the joys of youth, generally, apart from if you're in Steve's presentation. And contrary to much of the media narrative, or Socrates' narrative, they want to be good. And these are things that we've got to remember. We're told many things that are unsubstantiated about younger people. One of the reasons why we sort of sometimes push against generational theory or using it uncritically is because identity is just highly, highly intersectional. Matilda was talking about hybridity, and this is becoming more and more and more true. Right now, we could have put many more things and many more circles on this chart, but it wouldn't look as nice. But these are all kind of things. Now, if you are, LGBTQI+, that you might have something quite in common, whether you're 16 or 54. Right? But then if you look at that same couple of people through a totally different lens, one may be BAME, one may not. One may be from London, one may be from Hull. Right? We really have to bear this in mind, that the person's age or their generation or their life stage is just one layer, and it's not always necessarily important in defining people. So to just look at people through one lens is very, very tricky. Essentially, if we're thinking about time, let's put all that messy socioeconomic, demographic, lifestyle-y stuff to one side, and let's just think about age, right? Which is what we're talking about if we're talking about youth, right? We're not talking about age, we're talking about time, right? Very sort of deep here. Let's talk about time and Carl Jung. We're partly, yes, age and life course, right? So these age and life course effects are where individuals' behaviours, their attitudes change as they grow older or go through the life stages. So one of the things that struck me when I was listening to Sophia's presentation is how older people are less likely to see purpose-driven marketing, or maybe they are less likely to perceive that marketing is purpose-driven because they're more cynical as they've got older. And will people who are woke now be as woke when they are 70, when they've been ground down by life. We don't know, but there is data to show that actually we do develop. That in general, people do develop along quite similar lines attitudinally across life stages. All right, so sometimes when we're doing work, we don't really even look at age. What we look at is life stage. I remember when I first started as a researcher, and I was kind of London-based, London bubble, 24 years. Oh, let's go to Nottingham. I'm going to sit down and talk to some, 25 to 34-year-olds or 25 to 30-year-olds. They're going to be like me. Oh shit, they've got a car, 2 kids, a mortgage. They're nothing like me at all. Okay, so actually, their life stage is a very, very important thing. Period effects, very, very important, massively important, right? We all live in an internet-connected society. We all live in a more securitized society, whether we're younger or whether we're older, right? So these macro trends in culture and in life more broadly have massive, massive implications. And then there are cohort and generational effects. We're not saying there are none. We're saying they are part of this mix, and what we have to be very, very careful of is identifying when they're important and when they're not important, because otherwise we are marketing and communicating in an inauthentic way. Okay, so growing up with the social mobile internet is something that is particular to young people of this generation. I grew up with the internet, but not the kind of internet that young people are growing up with today. And it's very complicated. And that doesn't play well when we're trying to plan, and we especially plan media, right? But even when we're just strategically planning, creatively planning, complexity can sometimes be a bit, oh, come on, just give me the simple answer, give me the one-line capsule version. But we've got to be careful not to throw the baby out of the bathwater when we do that, all right? Actually, the 2 most important effects are period and age and life stage. They are the ones that condition us the most. Generational ones are important, but only in certain occasions. What they do is they do make generations different, and that's why we latch onto them so much, and that's why stuff like Matilda's work is really important, because it does show where the differences are, but we should also be looking for the commonalities. So some of the macro trends that are affecting UK youth culture, they're also affecting everybody else. But looking at when people grow up is a very, very important time, isn't it? It's formative, right? So the point is, while they affect everybody, how young people experience and manage them, right? Those are the cohort effects, right? So we are all living through a time where there is greater demography and diversity in our population in this country. We are all living in a time where the social mobile web is a thing. Even my mum's got WhatsApp. She's 67. Fragmentation, disaggregation of identity, of culture, all these kind of things are really, really, sort of prevalent for all of us. Now, an older person with a blue rinse is not necessarily somebody who you'll see down the Conservative club, but might be, a Shoreditch hipster. They just happen to be 60. Globalisation and hyperconnectivity, talked about already, these guys. The hegemony of neoliberal capitalism. This is probably the first generation who's growing up where there is very little debate about how we are organised at a socio-economic level. We have a much more issue-based politics, but the real kind of superstructure of our economy and our society is not really questioned, only really in a niche way. Right? There isn't no real left and right debate as once was in the 80s or even into the 90s. And a growing, on the other hand, while this speaks to Matilda's hybrid identities, on the one hand, youth culture at the moment is unashamedly accepting of capitalism, but also has a growing, if contested, and I put that in before Steve's presentation, social liberalism. It's worth saying that this presentation took about 3 hours, and there's tons of data and stuff behind it when I first gave it, so you're getting the capsule version. Right, so yeah, the internet. So just to think about what when we talk about the internet, it's all about the internet, isn't it? Young people are all on YouTube all the time, aren't they? Yes. Right, so but the internet has changed massively into being what it is now, right? So maybe even 15 years ago, 10 years ago, it was about top-down publishing. It was still the territory of traditional brands, news brands, publishers. Now it's about networked content creation. Everyone's a content creator. Going from fixed terminals to mobile phones, going from logging on to being always on, from search and pull to personalized push. That's a really important one, right? Because this idea that the internet is kind of a place for you to discover, that's kind of the way that it was sold to us when we were kind of growing up with the internet in the mid-90s and the early noughties. Now the internet is kind of curated for you in a way that you may not really even know about. Very different thing, a very different place to grow up in. Going from text to rich media, obvious, very slow. Those of you who may remember dial-up and how often a website might refresh. You know, you go on The Guardian the first thing in the morning, you go on The Guardian last thing at night, it looked exactly the same. You actually had to do some work, it was a nightmare. Yeah, longer, shorter, you know, like we're consuming content in ever smaller ways, you know, and this has a real impact for attention. And what we hear, the Daily Mail version, is young people have no attention span these days, they're rubbish. You know, why can't they sit down and just read a book? Studies of attention show that attention is changing, but not necessarily for the worse. Younger people can deal with attention with many more stimuli than older people can, because they're having to juggle lots of more different stimuli at any one time. So they are attention ninjas. They can do loads of stuff. So while they might not want to read War and Peace, they can probably read a bit of War and Peace while being on their phone and doing a load of other stuff. What that means for communicating with them is, you know, very profound. If we're talking about identity, which is some of the stuff that we've been talking about before and kind of where our heartland is, this is actually a 16-year-old in Holloway talking about, I put the post in because it's not a modern thing, it's a postmodern thing, but what she meant is quite a contemporary thing, how we have so many different types of labelling. If you think 50 years ago, our grandparents' age, they may not have had this many labels. They were just like, I'm from this place, this country. That's an intuitive understanding. That's not somebody who's even done their A-levels yet, right? They don't have Foucauldian frameworks and all that kind of stuff to talk about these things. They get it, right? And this is what Matilda was talking about, I think. Fluidity and eclecticism have trumped fixity. So back in time, you would be a mod or a rocker or a punk, or you were into West Coast hip-hop. Or, you know, you're a raver, right? And actually your badge of honour would be to stay as true to that orthodoxy as you possibly could. That was your identity, okay? What you are today is not what you're going to be tonight or tomorrow for young people, okay? And this goes back to this sort of intersectionality and all these kind of things. So each Monday I go to Pretty Little Thing, Topshop, and look at what's new each week so I can keep up to date with trends, actively looking to change on a daily, weekly basis, right? It makes things very tricky. You see this, and this is down to the new internet in many ways, right? The tools that are available to young people these days in terms of being able to be creative. You know, you see it everywhere, the explosion of street art, everyone being a photographer. You know, having a high-powered camera in your pocket, being able to filter and, you know, add to it and all this kind of, you see it everywhere. Anyone want to hazard a guess where some of these places are? Only one of them is Shoreditch. Leicester, yes, good, well done. Yeah, Leicester, Nottingham, Aston in Birmingham, and Digbeth in Birmingham. Right. So, but there's a real sort of resurgence of this kind of stuff, and it's actually seen as art and not as vandalism. Okay. Wish that happened when I was younger. But this also lives online, not just online. You know, you see that, you know, people dyeing their hair on a daily basis, weekly basis. You know, personalised goods of all kinds. Make your own trainers, all this kind of stuff. It's very difficult to pin down what this generation actually is because they can shape-shift on an almost minute-by-minute basis. And so, basically, where we're finishing up is it's messy and it's contradictory, you know, and maybe Matilda would say it's dual, and I say it probably is, but what it isn't neatly wrapped up in a bow. So when someone comes to you with a brief, tell me about Gen Z, or tell me about millennials, or you read a piece that says they are all this, they are all that, These are just some of the things some of the ways in which one person can contradict themselves, but they're not. We're all contradictory. We're all messy. So they value the digital, but they value in real life experiences. We hear about the experience economy all the time. They're very futuristic and tech savvy, yet we've seen a massive explosion in the retro, in vintage, in nostalgia. They're global, but they're local. We've talked about that. They're material, but they like experiential. They're isolated, aren't they? Because they're all sitting on their phones and playing Fortnite in their own bedrooms and not talking like we used to when we were younger, apart from the fact that they're talking on Fortnite the entire time and playing with 99 other people. Yes, they're highly individual, highly personalised, but they value sharing, community and collaboration. Love Island is all about fakery and superficiality, isn't it? But we're told about authenticity all the time, and that things need to be authentic. And but we put a filter on an Instagram post. What do we do with that? They're blind to appearance. They don't care. And it doesn't matter what you should look like. It doesn't matter what you should. You shouldn't judge a book by its cover. Yet we spend all our time stylizing ourselves and not on our Instagram posts. We're passive and we're sedentary, but we value active things. And that's not to say that we can't understand this, but it's about using the right tools and experts and conducting proper, pointed insight work, not necessarily with my agency, although it would be nice, but to truly understand the phenomenon that and the group of people that we're trying to understand. I'm sure if you went to Steve and asked him about the kind of 30% that feel left behind, this would be a very different chart to if we were to go down into kind of Leighton and Hoxton and Shoreditch and Clapton and do the same piece of work. And that's it.